Welcome everyone to our Digital Contracting for Net Zero series, where we explore with leaders in the field how legal and contract management teams are driving corporate climate ambition in Australia, harnessing current state and emerging technology. So today we're joined by Alicia Ballantyne from Sterling Rose and Peter Moulton from Sensand. Together, we'll be exploring the limitations of current contract lifecycle management systems in enabling net zero and how next generation contracting, aka smart legal contracts, will radically uplift climate contracting for Scope 3 across supply chains. So Alicia is a passionate explorer of emerging technology, the evolution of digital law, AI, cybersecurity, and the application of DLT, so distributed ledger technology or blockchain, to commercial contracting. Alicia has extensive experience in contract management, including research and commercialization contracting at the internationally renowned Baker Heart and Diabetes Institute. Peter is co-founder and CEO of Sensand, an earth technology company that uses technology, primarily blockchain, to improve agricultural outcomes by making data more transparent in carbon markets. Peter leads a team of 30 engineers, software developers, and business strategists, and together they'll be launching a global carbon trading exchange in early 2023. So welcome, Alicia and Peter. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation at the pointy edge of legal and technology, working together for climate. So Alicia, let's start with you. What does contracting for net zero mean to you, and how is digital contracting a key enabler for climate aligned contracting? Over to you, Alicia.
Well, thank you for having us. It's a pleasure to talk on this topic. So for me, contracting for net zero means aligning and transitioning an organisation's net zero goals into its contracting strategy. So that is across its life cycle, from procurement all the way through execution, and then obviously once the contract is live and on foot. So it actually means that your organisation's net zero objectives and goals from your transition plan, ideally, specifically embedded in your contracting, and it's used as a viable tool to achieve those goals. So the scale of the pledges and the target setting that we're seeing in industry at the moment is obviously quite impressive. However, you would know and you will hear that the underlying theme is that we very quickly need to move from goal setting and targets to actualizing the performance. So, you know, when we're talking about these sorts of discussions, we often hear the what, for example. So what interventions can deliver this meaningful change that we're discussing, and obviously then the how. So how do we do this? You know, how do we account for greenhouse gas emissions and interventions within our organisational supply chain? And how can we accurately translate that data from upstream interventions into downstream reporting? So that is where we'll talk about some smart legal contracting interventions and how they might fit into your organisation and how they work. So contracting, specifically smart legal contracting, is a tool by which we can measure and verify the impacts of your net zero implementation plan within your organisation.
So what are the limitations of our current contract lifecycle management capability within Australian corporates? Why is that ill-equipped?
Yeah, so in many ways, climate-aligned contracting is really no different to other contracts. They perform over a period of time. However, traditional contracts that we've all been involved with in different organisations, obviously I've had a lot of interaction with, they're quite static. So by virtue of being static, it means that should I need information, I need to go and get an external reference point. So that might be perhaps within my organisation or from an external place. And ultimately, if we need that information to validate performance, we need to go and find it to see if there's a contractual alignment, for example, or what has occurred, or even if there's potentially some sort of dispute. So if you are able to digitize a contract by way of a smart legal contract, which we'll talk about in a second exactly what I'm talking about when I use that terminology, then you can see a contract across its life cycle in real time. So for example, you could see it at execution point and drafting even prior to that, as it performs actions embedded within the contract over time, and creates a data trail within the contract itself. So if you have variations, for example, you can see these. So obviously one of the pain points, particularly in-house, is where these things sit within an organization, usually in a bottom drawer potentially, or in various iterations of your file management system or your contract lifecycle system. So all these data flows that occur across a contract lifecycle can be kept together in a neat and organized way. I know that's a holy grail moment and an endpoint that we all desire. It's indexable and searchable, and it's actually a digital mirror of a real world events that are happening. So that's the dynamic nature, that we move away from the static nature of traditional into the dynamic nature of smart legal contracts. In-house, we often speak about trying to find the single source of truth and where that sits. And smart legal contracting can be that truth. So it also, importantly, I think, gives a mechanism by which to verify the claims that you might be making to market, for example, particularly in a net zero sense. So I've obviously spoken about the smart legal contracting component, so it's probably an important distinction to make, that there is a difference between smart contracts, which are executable code running on a blockchain. So that might be crypto assets or a digital token, for example. And whilst they can be legally binding, and we see that sometimes, they're not necessarily suitable for enterprise legal agreements. So the distinction that we make, therefore, to smart legal contracts is they are legally binding digital contracts, and some or all of the obligations that are sitting within the contract are defined in or performed by a computer program. So they're basically digital machine readable elements of a contract that are coded and embedded into a structured data format, and Peter can speak on this, that can be processed without human intervention on a digital platform. So that might be DLT or blockchain, for example. So these active functions that are embedded, they're picked up, and the how, the when, and the why of those certain elements and how they're affected by the data flows. And Peter can speak to this further from internal and external reference points. So it's no longer a static piece of paper in a drawer or a spreadsheet perhaps, but an instrument that can collect information as reactive to data streams.
Fantastic. I mean, we've heard about contracts becoming digital assets. This is what we're talking about right here. Contracts actually being able to perform obligations, to be able to extract data from oracles. And this is a great segue to introducing you to the conversation, Peter. You're working on a DLT, it's a digital ledger technology, distributed ledger technology enabled carbon credit trading platform. What does that mean? Tell us about the platform, the problem you're solving, and why blockchain?
Thanks, and also nice to be here. I obviously know that you guys are in the legal space, and hopefully I can contribute something to the conversation there. So yeah, we've built a carbon trading platform which we're launching early next year. So it's the last day of the month, I think, of November. So we're almost in 2023, and the idea with that is that we're going to be able to list all of the global carbon trading assets that are traded globally at the moment in that environment. The thing that we do that's different is that we came from an agriculture and technology background first. So we're all about measuring or improving the performance of using your land. It could be if you were running cattle or growing crops or fields, you could use all of these tools to help you improve the efficiency of that productivity wise. But all of that same data became like absolutely critical for measuring high value or performance inside carbon assets. So if we fast forward through and you've got a global market for trading or for getting towards net zero, the offsetting market is a key part of that. You're never going to be absolute zero. Net zero is about when you do create some emissions, you can offset that in a way that actually is really having said impact. So what we do at a platform and at the way that we're approaching it is that you can take any of the data operationally in the field on the ground and move it into the methodologies of different countries, jurisdictions. Europe's got their way that they calculate greenhouse gas and emissions. Australia, US, all these countries have slightly different methodologies. They're trying to standardize that under the COP agreements, but it's still not globally unified. So what we do is give all of this data and can put it through to any type of tradable carbon instrument globally. And I guess tying that into this conversation, all of the data points that we get can become oracles that go into the performance and validation of ESG contracting requirements, the issuing of certain credits or certain co-benefits that are required or at least agreed to by certain parties. We can be the data source for those verifications to measure the performance of an existing contract between certain parties.
I'm just wondering, is there an example that we can share with our audience around data points that are used in contracting? Alicia, shall I hand back to you or Peter? Who'd like to kick off this conversation?
I'll kick off first, and then we can sort of tie it into an example contract, and I can then loop it back in. So, if somebody has a particular property and they're planting 100 million trees, for example, to create new carbon assets, like new carbon credits that will get sold at some point, you can put contracts in place where you are forward selling those credits for the sake of argument, because they might not issue out for a few years. It's like a crop, you know, you're growing an apple. Well, you can't eat the apple until the tree's grown and then the apple is grown and then you pick it, right? Well, carbon's a bit different. You can actually buy those units early straight away. Now, if you are taking those units and then issuing them out, somebody is going to want to buy those and use those at a certain point in time. And there might be agreements that you've come to with another party. So the link through to that is that you might say, I will do these certain things by this certain time, and we can measure that and put it into a contract that is measured as an oracle to say, I did achieve said outcome, I did actually offset my amount this year, I did hit my target. Any of these types of things we can measure and can get put into code that triggers the compliance or the performance of an existing contract that's written in natural language.
Alicia, would you like to explore that a bit further as far as provisions in contracts? I mean, we're seeing a lot of inefficiency, right, in the market at the moment for climate contracting. We have, you know, the ability, it's a major problem. I see corporates exchanging spreadsheets outlining their footprint, their carbon footprint. I'd love to hand over to you.
Yeah, well, it's funny you should mention spreadsheets, because I was actually just reading a report the other day that was basically said that 55% of the top 500 reporting companies against, say, their ESG requirements were housing that data in spreadsheets, and that for the vast majority, the collection and manual handling of that data was very, very time and physically labour intensive. So just on the spreadsheet point, I think that's an interesting and very commonly used way by which this information is going both up to regulators and or across parties. And obviously with it, some key inefficiencies. I think one of the key opportunities, I guess, and also one of the challenges that we see in contracting broadly, and can tie specifically back to the net zero sort of ambition and goals, is that with regulation coming in across the world globally, we expect that the burden of proof for corporates will uplift. So the validation of their reporting data is going to come up. So, you know, Peter's example previously, that might just be a word of mouth situation. We've had to go out and seek the data. We've given the data in exchange and it's happened. With the input of a smart legal contract and the API feeding into it, that data and the veracity of that data is validated and it's live. And so you don't get a lag, for example, the human in the loop going out and validating and feeding it back through the cycle. It's live and it's actionable in real time when the code mode is kicked off. So you can, for example, in an audit of supply chain, you can actually see what's happening, and you can not only see it, but you can demonstrate that via the smart legal contract. And because of the immutable form of the blockchain, for example, it's a timestamp. You can see everything that's happening across the span, and the validity of that data, which, as we know, particularly with net zero objectives and reporting, is often called into question, and not the veracity of it is not necessarily believed to be true. And obviously there's terms that go along with that we should maybe we shan't name here. But the evidence point, I think, and the feed-in loop from the Oracle is critical. So from an organizational perspective, obviously you could do an audit and very quickly identify where you're seeking data input for different clauses, and you could potentially tag that. You can pop your code in, and that can be an automated process by which maybe in the first instance you would get a notification to action upon, as opposed to being self-executing. But I think very quickly, once you have some confidence in the process and it's less foreign, you would quickly transition to, self-executing clauses, for example, as they go through.
This is a really interesting conversation. I'm just wondering, we have a lot of lawyers on this, listening to this webinar and this podcast. What is the impact of this on lawyers and what they do and how they do it?
So they won't probably be done out of a job, if that's a concern point, which anything that integrates sort of an automation is a key issue and concern. But so if you think of the body of a contract as natural language, which, we all draft in and is quite commonly known to us, it has its binding terms, and that would remain largely the same. The executable code component that comes in essence becomes the arms and legs of the contract, and that's what gives it life and makes it perform. So I guess, as I just alluded to, like the transition to any new thing, we would expect in the first instance, when you're starting to get used to this technology and to embed it into your workplace and into your work, that you would maybe put out the call and it would come back to you and you would validate that and, action. Whereas I think increasingly, again, the trust element, and once you saw it working, you would quickly do away with that, and these clauses would self-execute when certain parameters that you've set and predefined are met. So I think, if you were to look to starting a real world implementation in your organization, for example, you would likely turn your mind to provisions within your commonly used contracts that give it life, for example, and you would start maybe a mapping exercise along the lines of where the relevant provisions seek their data, that data input source, for example, and then what you would do to automate those input sources.
So this is I guess the elephant in the room here is around distributed ledger technology or blockchain as an enabler, fits and starts. When is it going to happen? Are there real world examples now where this technology is being used to support smart legal contracts, perhaps in other areas? What timeframes are we looking at before this is the way in which climate contracting takes place? And we really hope it all takes on very well. And we Australian corporates will use platforms such as your carbon trading platform, soon to be launched, Peter, to enable this. I'd love to understand where you think and when this will happen.
I think that the ability to take any privately owned data that's going on in the real world and to start linking it through to performance inside a financial instrument or a contract in the form of a smart legal contract is really, really close. And from a practical perspective, it's probably going to be more it's probably going to be able to be implemented and used faster than people are going to be able to necessarily adopt it at scale, particularly in regards to things like a contract, because you need so many people with natural language contracts that are going to get scattered all over the place that all need to reference things. There's a certain inertia behind that, and it's going to take time. But the bit that isn't going to be as difficult, I suppose, is the element of saying that these things happened over here and I want to affect the performance or the result of that in the real world, but that is quite that's actually reasonably close. I think there's probably going to be some cultural changes, but the thing that is really relevant here is that you can take a requirement of something that you've agreed to between two parties, and you can reference that thing that you've both agreed to, and that Oracle can decide the performance of whether you were or weren't compliant. And then once you can achieve that with something small, you can start widening it out. So we've been talking a lot about carbon, but when you're talking about things like this, it can move into all these other elements of things that are co-benefits, like biodiversity, natural capital accounting, things along those sort of lines. And if you are replanting 1 million trees, you're going to get a benefit that is not just measured by your carbon amounts that got put back into the soil, for example. You're going to be creating biodiversity and ecosystem assets that's also quantifiable. And if you've got a party who's agreed to say, I am going to do this in a contract for my ESG obligations, and two people or two parties agree to that, we actually can start to measure that. So that's a like that is the future, but it's 2023, not 2033, that those types of things are going to start being done. And then it's up to the market, all of us holistically, to move towards those things as quickly as possible, because it is a bit of an arms race to net zero by 2050, right? Like, it's not like we can wait 10 years for change. Like, you need to start doing those things immediately. So it's incumbent on all of us to do our part to contribute to that. And yeah, we want to be one of the technology layers that makes those, to enable that, so that other parties can start implementing it as part of their ESG requirements in Australia, but also globally.
We wish you all the best in that, Peter. This is a grand plan, and 2023, wow, that's really comforting to know, because we need to, as we started off this whole conversation, the importance of reporting and monitoring. It's like the how, and we're really, Australian corporates are really working hard on that, as you mentioned earlier on, Alicia. So let's wrap up. I would like to know your key take-homes for our audience around what they can be doing to support the future of digitally enabled, climate, future. Can we start with you, please, Alicia?
Sure. So I spoke to it earlier, but I think one of the main things is to know that smart legal contracts are a tool. So we acknowledge that as a standalone, obviously they're not a silver bullet, but they certainly give you a tool, a mechanism by which you can measure and verify the impacts of your implementation plan that you have within your organisation, and address any recurrent issues that we see and hear regarding the sort of data verification and validation in the market that's currently happening, and some topical conversations that are being had. And I think also it's important because a lot of it might sound like a lot of work, and if you're particularly coming from an in-house perspective, you know that your bucket is full and overflowing. But from a business perspective, that the ability to evidence to consumers that you are taking these steps within your organisation to make measurable change actually will have a really lovely kickback. And I think as we move, to a more conscious environment where consumers are making choices based on what organisations are doing, this is one mechanism by which you can actually validate, what you are doing.
Thank you, Alicia. Peter?
I think the key takeaway for me is that actually writing into a contract that you are going to comply with things is one thing. We've probably just reached this phase in the technology level where those things actually can start to be measured and can be provable rather than just claimable. And as the sophistication of the market increases on the way that we quantify things, you can start getting more sophisticated on the things that you're saying that you're going to do and actually prove that you've done it. I think that there's a bit of a, some companies can be accused of greenwashing things from time to time, saying that they're doing things, but it's not actually doing it. I think that we're at that point now where you know, we're not going to be able to hide as easily around those things. Proving that you've done something is very, very close to being possible at scale. And that means that we can all be held accountable to actually achieving those results. So I think that it's going to be a really fascinating next 5 years in this space. Things have moved incredibly quickly at a technology level. The way that the innovation at the pure tech sense has just screamed ahead. And I know there's a lot of controversy around blockchain, Web3, DLT technologies from the scandals perspective, but we can't miss the forest for the trees. We need to see that these things, as Alicia said, they are tools. And just because every now and then there's some bad actors, and for those who are following the news, you know, FTX happened a couple of weeks ago, that doesn't mean that we should say that everything about it is bad. There are great parts about this that can make material difference, and we need to embrace the good and still keep pushing things forward. So that's probably a key takeaway for me, but it's extra topical given that I'm in the technology markets and this is very new information and everything. I'll just hate to think that the macros can slow anything down from moving forward progressively into this space. So, but I'm an optimist. I think that we're all on the right track. So I'm really looking forward to 23 and beyond.
So it's great. Thank you, Alicia and Peter, for inspiring us today with the art of the possible, coming and becoming real and realistic and tangible from next year. So we look forward to following you both and seeing how you change the world for the better. As Mahatma Gandhi said, be the change you wish to see in the world. I'm Natalia Sinimarkovic, Distinguished Fellow with the Centre for Legal Innovation. Have a good day.